But what had really changed kind of the trajectory of my life was when I turned 13. The Chinese economy was really taking off. So the GDP was growing double figures. And my parents have always kind of kept their pulse on everything in Asia anyway. But it was that year, and I think like '05, they decided to do something really drastic where they're going to uproot my entire family. So I have a younger brother and sister, and then they're going to move us to South China, in Foshan in Guangdong. And we're just going to live there for 3 years, not go to school. We're going to study online with Johns Hopkins University. And we're just going to travel around all of Asia for 3 years and just give our kids this kind of immersion experience, hoping that with that experience that they'll better understand their roots and their heritage, they'll better understand Asia, hopefully maybe pique their interest in wanting to learn the language and maybe do something with Asia and China in the future.
Hi everyone, welcome to 北腔南调, aka Cultural Collision. I'm Melody.
I'm Victoria.
And today we're excited to have an inspirational female entrepreneur join us today to share with us her story. Founder and CEO of Pursuit International, president of the Beijing Women's Network, and a true scholar who's won over $1.3 million in scholarship to graduate debt-free. Welcome, world traveler Leslie.
Hey guys, thank you both so much for inviting me to this. It's such an honor, and I'm so excited to be part of this project. Oh, so cool.
So Leslie, could you tell us a little bit about yourself as well as your upbringing, just to give our audience a little understanding about you?
Yeah, absolutely. My background's actually a bit complex. I'm just like you, Melody. I'm what you call ABC, so American born Chinese. But for people that are probably listening, you know that being Chinese is actually can be very, very diverse. There's a lot of subcategories of what you consider Chinese. And that's the case with my family. So both my parents are not from mainland China. My dad's family is originally from Hong Kong, but he grew up in Vietnam, in the middle of the Vietnam War, fortunately. And then my mom is from Taiwan. Both of them met when they immigrated to Colorado in the United States, met and fell in love, and then had me and my siblings. So I'm born and raised in Boulder, Colorado, and this is in a lot of ways like my home. I'm as Colorado as it comes. Love hiking, love skiing, and I llove Colorado sunsets. That's just my life. Every time I come back, it's like this feels right. This feels right.
Can you tell us about the Pursuit International and what led you to start your journey to build bridges between the US and China through empowering young women, and what inspired you?
Yeah, well, that's a really big question, Victoria. That's like my entire life story I gotta lay out for you now. I think well, it didn't always start out that way. I would say, like, I don't know how it's like for most entrepreneurs, but in my case, I didn't grow up wanting to be an entrepreneur. It wasn't something that I was like at 5 years old, like, this is what I'm gonna grow up to be. This is what I want to like become. This is how I'm gonna make my money. This is how I'm gonna build a lifestyle. It really wasn't like that at all. And I consider myself more of a social entrepreneur. So I'm an entrepreneur with usually like a social mission. I'm usually there to try to provide value in a different way outside of just obviously making profit, making money. I think entrepreneurship was something that really had kind of fallen on my lap. And it's just like a long story to kind of go through. I think that throughout my life, I've spent a lot of time just going in between the US and China, and really building been really always really interested in this kind of cultural space between the two countries since I was like 13, all the time. And so that was always going to be something that was really, really important to me. And I majored in international affairs. I wanted to contribute in some way to US-China relations. But so there aren't a lot of careers at that time when I was about to graduate that can enable you to do that. So for the longest time, I thought I was just going to be a diplomat. I thought that, that working for the foreign service, for the Foreign Service, for the State Department would be the best and easiest way to continue the work I want to do building US-China bridges. And then reality hit me when I actually started looking into the process of becoming a diplomat and realized that you don't get to choose the country you go to in the beginning of your career. You go wherever the government wants you. And for the first few years, they're usually never going to send you to the countries that you have any type of cultural knowledge in, because they deem it almost too sensitive. They're worried that you're going to build too many connections with locals, so that you can be compromised and you have a chance of being bribed. So that meant that being a diplomat would have been really cool to travel all over the world and serve under the US government and further kind of American values and culture overseas. But it also meant that it completely defied what I wanted to do, which is like I wanted to do more with US China. But if it became a diplomat, I don't think they're ever going to send me to China. Or I'll have to wait until much later on in my senior career to be able to choose. So then I was at this like crossroads, as a lot of people are when they're about to graduate university, where you're not entirely sure where you want to go. You kind of maybe have an inkling because you chose a major, you're about to graduate, you got a degree, but you're still not entirely sure of where your life is going. And in my case, I was really, what's the right word? Like I was just really, really conflicted because I wanted to live and work in Asia. I wanted to be in China, but the family I grew up in was quite conservative and quite traditional. And my entire family was in Colorado. And my mom was going through a lot of health issues at that time too. And the eldest daughter and eldest child, they really wanted me to stay put in Colorado. And so I was just really conflicted for a really long time with that. And then eventually kind of just hit me that if I couldn't find something that could fulfill and satisfy the things that I really want and the needs that I have, then I guess the best way to go about that is actually just to create it myself. And so that's exactly what I did. And I had an idea before I graduated too, was this idea about wanting to create more and deeper, meaningful kind of cross-cultural exchanges between the US and China. Again, with my background, I care a lot about any global issues around US China. And I've always felt so lucky that even though my family's not from mainland China, and in a lot of ways we're like the periphery of that because we're just like that Chinese diaspora that we grew up in. But how lucky am I that I have heritage and like a foot through the door through two of the most powerful countries in the world, and I can understand what's happening on both sides. How many people are born with those cards to begin with? And then on top of that, it's like I got this Hong Kong piece, I got this Taiwan piece, which is so diverse, as you know, and there's a lot of other like geopolitics that come into play with all that. But I have all of that, this deck of cards that was just given to me from the moment I was born, that it would have been just such a waste if I didn't do something about it. And the idea I had was, I felt like, number one, we needed more people that study and care about US-China relations on both sides. So not just scholars, not just politicians, not just business people, but I felt like you had to start earlier. You had to start with students. And I didn't like the current models of that time, which there were a lot of like study abroad and immersion experiences, but they were very limited in terms of the interactions you were actually going to have with local people. For a lot of Americans, you're like, oh, you're going to study in China, you spend a year there, and you're going to Chinese classes, and that's kind of the extent of all that. How many Americans actually are there in China for a year and make really close Chinese friends? And vice versa. It's not easy for Chinese students that are studying in the US to actually break through and actually build meaningful connections. And on top of that, I think most importantly, which is the pain point I wanted to solve, was I wanted to help nurture a generation of Americans and Chinese that were capable of working professionally with each other. So not just becoming friends. I wanted to train up American and Chinese students that could work effectively and professionally in a team and deliver projects across both cultures. And so I set out to kind of create and launch my own exchange program like that, and then turn that into a company. So that first company was called GSI, called Global Student Initiative. What I did was I took a team of 10 American students in Colorado, Boulder, Colorado. Most of them were from the University of Colorado, Boulder. So that's where I graduated. And I took a team of 10 Chinese students in Beijing. And these are students from all over Beijing, from all these different Beijing kind of universities. Because you have a bigger cluster of universities in Beijing that you can draw from. So now you have a team of two teams of 10 on each side. And then I had these teams work remotely with each other for an entire year to create an exchange program for each other. So the students designed their own exchange program. And then in the summer, they would then launch the program. So Chinese students would come to Boulder, Colorado for 10 days. And you had the American students bring them around in this program that they specially designed for these Chinese students. And then you would then have the same group of Chinese students go to Beijing and have the Chinese students kind of bring them around for 10 days. And I was also very, very strict on requirements of what these exchange programs have to be. Like, I'm not funding you so that you can spend 10 days just partying and having fun. You're designing an exchange program that I required a certain number of company visits. You had to set up a certain number of guest lectures you had to have at different universities. Very limited sightseeing, but a lot of discussion. So I forced the students have to learn all these skills along the way collaboratively. So you have to be able to pitch yourself to potentially a company, to set up a company visit. You had to be able to coordinate between your teams of how you're going to do that. You had to figure out the logistics of everything. So where's everyone living and staying, and how are meals going to be like, who's picking who up at the airport. We're figuring out the visa situation. And then everyone had to do a certain amount of fundraising as well, in addition to budgeting. So yeah, I went ahead and launched that my senior year while I was still in school, writing 2 theses, something like an honors thesis, which is 80 pages, and a full load of classes. But I managed to pull it all off and managed to still graduate summa cum laude, 3.98 GPA, and then with this company. And that kind of really like kickstarted my entrepreneurial journey.
Wow, what an amazing journey, amazing story. Leslie is truly superwoman.
No, not at all. You try your best.
No, oh man. Would love to dig deeper into like the challenges and stuff that you dealt with. Before that, I do want to ask Leslie, you shared earlier that you're an ABC. So you grew up in Colorado and your parents are there as well. So when was the first time you went to Asia, whether it be Taiwan, Hong Kong, or China? And what made you have that initial interest in connecting the US and China? Like, when did you realize that you have such a powerful identity that connects two of the most powerful nations in this world?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, thank you so much for asking that question, because I love talking about this too. I think that I've been really, really blessed, kind of with how my life has panned out. And I think the vast majority of Chinese Americans, you probably agree with me, Melody, or maybe it's a little more diverse where you grew up in LA, but most Chinese Americans that I know of and grew up with are very conflicted kind of in the way that they grew up, because when they're at home, they're kind of surrounded by this like traditional kind of Asian culture of their parents, which can feel very foreign, even though that like technically like this is your culture, but you only know it in the context of home, because the moment you leave home, you're surrounded often by like white people on this white American culture. And so growing up, it's just always this conflict of never being enough on either side. You're never Chinese enough. You're never Asian enough. You actually don't have enough points of references to fully understand where your parents are coming from with the way that your parents grew up and the culture and values that they're referring to. But you walk out and you just don't fit in the same way with all your white peers. Like you totally don't celebrate Christmas the same way. And I think growing up for a long time is that conflict of I kind of just want to be white. I kind of just want to just like blend in and be like everyone else. And I grew up in Boulder, Colorado, which is extremely white. It wasn't until I think like 10 years old until I met another person that can speak Chinese. And it wasn't even Cantonese. Like I grew up speaking Cantonese first. It was Mandarin. So it was like, oh, well, does that really count? But what had really changed kind of the trajectory of my life was when I turned 13. When I was 13, I was like 2005-ish. The Chinese economy was really taking off. So the GDP is growing double figures. By double figures is all over the news. It's always just constant kind of like development in China. But it was that year, and I think like '05, where my parents kind of just like chatted to each other and then realized, oh my gosh, like China is probably gonna be the future of the world one way or another. There's no stopping it. This is the trajectory where things are really gonna go. This is the time to invest if you can, because this is where China's really picking up. And our kids are born with all these great resources linguistically, our heritage and all these things. But unless we did something drastic now, they're going to lose access to all of that because they're basically growing up as just white kids right now. So my parents both also like very entrepreneurial too. I think it's part of just our like they've also both built a lot of restaurants, but a few companies on the side and all of that. And now own a real estate company and all this. They decided to do something really drastic where they're going to uproot my entire family. So I have a younger brother and sister, and then they're going to move us to South China, in Foshan in Guangdong, and we're just going to live there for 3 years, not go to school. We're going to study online with Johns Hopkins University and their online programs, and we're just going to travel around all of Asia for 3 years and just give our kids this kind of immersion experience, hoping that with that experience that they'll better understand their roots and their heritage, they'll better understand Asia, hopefully maybe pique their interest in wanting to learn the language, pick up the language on the way, and maybe do something with Asia and China in the future. They never forced anything on us, but they wanted to keep that door open and reinforce that door to make sure it was there and open for us as an option. My dad actually stayed in the US to work, so to help finance our 3 years there. And then it was just my mom and 3 kids. And you have to keep in mind that, again, neither one of my parents are from mainland China. So neither one of them actually had that much experience or knowledge of mainland China. They're really like Taiwanese and Cantonese. And that's who they are. And so for them, China was also very much a foreign country for both of them as well. And the challenge that my mom had to go through, I can only imagine that this woman who's basically almost like a single mom now because her husband's working in the US, is taking 3 kids all under the age of 14. It was 13, 12, and 9, or 8. And we're moving to her like a foreign country and settling there and buying a house and getting us all settled. But it's because they did that so that it gave me this immersion experience for 3 years. And it's from these 3 years that had really changed who I was as a person, how I perceived myself, my identity, how I identified as. But those 3 experiences were not without its own challenges. It was also a very, very challenging experience for all of us as well. I think early 2000s, that area in China, they hadn't had as much exposure to kind of foreigners or this understanding of a Chinese American person that's ethnically Chinese, but is actually like completely basically white. And so we were bullied a lot. There was a lot of discrimination that we faced during that time. A lot of really hurtful things that we had to go through. Oh, you call yourself American, but you don't have blue eyes and blonde hair, and a lot of jeering and a lot of laughing at us. And there's this like shame, this constant shaming that we experience but you're Chinese, you're ethnically Chinese. How could you be so dumb and stupid that you don't speak any Chinese? There was an element of ageism as well. I think as Americans too, our culture is very flat, fairly flat, like democratically, we're very flat. and that we believe that everyone's voice deserves to be heard, regardless of who you are and your age as well. So 13-year-old Leslie also felt like I was entitled to being heard, even though I was only 13. And that was not the experience I had in South China. It's like adults I would speak to would treat me fairly, like respectfully, until they found out how old I actually was. I think I just dressed older than my age, so they all thought I was a little older than I was until they found out how old I was. Then it completely changed. It's like, well, shut up because you don't know anything. You're too young. When adults are speaking, don't talk, don't interrupt. Like you don't know anything about the world. Just like shut up and listen. So like a lot of that was very hard to swallow. But I think maybe the worst part wasn't the kind of pieces around ageism or your nationality. It was actually about gender. Gender was kind of the most shocking thing, sexism, that I just had not encountered in that way. And I think this later inspired all the work I do around women's issues too, where I lived in a really affluent area. That's one thing that my parents was like had to make sure was really important, that at least our standard of living was still would maintain. Otherwise, it would have been hard for us to kind of survive those 3 years. So I lived in a really kind of affluent area in a villa. We had like 3 stories. We had an individual house. We had a front and back garden. We had a garage and all this stuff. So you would expect that other neighbors that live in these complexes, they would definitely all be very affluent, but you would expect them to be also like fairly well behaved and educated as well. But there's this one incident where I was just riding on their kind of shuttle buses within the complex, and we had a neighbor who was also on that shuttle bus, and he has always been this like kind of like prickly personality, but for that one occasion, shuttle bus, my mom wasn't there with us. It was just me and my younger brother and sister. He suddenly came up to me like on the bus, and then he said, half joking, but also half like making fun of me. He said, you should ask the bus driver if he's willing to just marry you and take you in. And he said it all in Cantonese, because you're pretty much useless. You can't speak any Chinese. There's no hope for you. You should just do us all a favor and just see if you can kind of just like marry yourself off. Laughed about it in front of my face, thought it was really, really funny, was jeering about it, and his friends were laughing. And I knew he said that because he also knew I couldn't actually retort back. He knew that I understood everything he would say, but that I did not have the Cantonese or the Mandarin at that time to have said anything back to him. So he could have his way with me, which was a horrible experience to have at 13. And even if I decided to retort in English, if I said something in English, it almost just proved his point. Like, oh yeah, I really can't. I'm really useless when it comes to Chinese. So you're exactly right. So you just have to like hold your tongue, bite it, and swallow that. And that moment kind of, it was so traumatic, but it highlighted a lot of things. It highlighted kind of the nationality piece, the language piece. It also highlighted this ingrained kind of sexism in there. It's like, oh, your worth is who you marry. Your worth as a woman, like that's what you strive for in life, is like become really educated, become just amazing, all these things, just so that you have a higher chance to find a husband. And that was really kind of the line that he was towing, which is just horrible. And I've never been through that type of shock in my life. It did make me realize how sheltered I am growing up in the United States, in Colorado. I did not realize this. I didn't expect this to happen. There are just 2 ways that you can respond to that. Like you either like completely shut down and you accept defeat, or you choose to kind of rise to the occasion. And I definitely chose the latter. But I didn't do it really for me. I did it really for my family. My dad, before he left us and went back to the US, so he helped us settle in initially. He said goodbye to us in Taipei. So we decided to take a little family trip before we went back to Foshan, just hang out in Taipei. I've never lived without my dad in my life. I'm 13 years old. And it came to that moment when you had to say goodbye. We all knew it was happening. You knew we were all dreading it, but what it was going to happen one way or another, and you you just kind of had to get through it. So he was by the doorway, saying his final goodbyes, and he like put his arms out. He took my brother and sister in with each of his hands, his arms, right? So he's hugging my brother with one and then hugging my sister with the other one. So he ran out of arms for me. There were three arms, unfortunately. So I did the best I could. I just like pressed myself up against his chest, like trying to hug him. Like I hugged him, but he obviously couldn't really reciprocate. He tried his best. And then he whispered in my ear and he said, "Leslie, please take care of them for me." I was 13. Uh, and that was like a really, in hindsight, like as an adult, I think back about it and I think it was like a very heartbreaking thing that my dad had to do. There's no one else that can do this. My brother is 8 years old. My sister is like 11, 12. It's just me and my mom. And you cannot expect my mom to be there in every instance to take care of everything that can happen to us. So I have to step up and do my part to help take care of everyone else. If I could take care of one extra thing, which is my brother and sisters, that's one less thing that my mom has to worry about. And that's one less thing that my dad has to worry about in the other side of the world. And so yeah, from that day on, I really threw myself into doing what I can to help take care of my family. And I think that's the day that personally for me kind of marked the end of my childhood. And I realized really quickly the most important thing that I can do is make sure that I learn Chinese, Mandarin and Cantonese at the same time, because in that region of China, you had to use both. So it was 10 characters a day, every day for 3 years. And then we bought all these like reading, all these like textbooks for kids learning Chinese that came with like a little CD of that time. So I locked myself in a room and try to read phonetically, like what all the words were like, and then record them in this old fashioned little like cassette thing that I had then, and then replay it and compare it to this CD-ROM or like the CD they had to just figure out where my pronunciations were. So for me, learning Chinese, I cannot say it was an enjoyable experience. And I can't say that I had done it at the time when I didn't learn it with love. I didn't learn it because I love the language and wanted to learn. I learned the language out of anger, and I learned the language out of fear, and I learned the language because I felt an obligation to do it to take care of my family. And I remember all I wanted, the biggest goal in my life at that time was like, I just want to be able to walk through the street and just be able to read one character out of every sign, every billboard, every street sign that I could pass by. I just needed to read one character. Like that would be a dream come true for me, because it was still so impossible to think of me actually being fluent in the language. And I finally hit that when I was about 16. And that was just like a miracle to me. Like I made the impossible happen. And at that point, like once you kind of hit that tipping point, it gets a little bit easier and you get a little bit more comfortable learning, a little bit more comfortable speaking, even though I'm still terrified to speak because you're scared of all these things. You're scared of being yelled at in public, teased more if you don't sound right. It's almost like if you're Chinese American in China, there's no leeway for you. You have to be perfect. But after I hit that tipping point, and I ended up dating like a Chinese guy, which helped a lot. That I finally finally opened this door into China. Like this door finally opened for me, and once that opened for me, like people just started treating me very differently. It went from constantly like battering you of like you're it's so embarrassing, it's such a shame of who you are that you can't speak the language, to oh, you're doing so well, and it's so awesome that you're willing to learn the language even though you're American. I'm like how like night and day, like how, like what? But like around the same area, kind of same people, but how is it that you could have this massive shift just because I finally hit that kind of tipping point? And then because I hit that tipping point, it just helped me realize that it wasn't that people were just awful to be awful. They were a product of like the society and the times and the values that they grew up in. And there's just a level of ignorance and a level of maybe a level of jealousy as well. Like, oh, this is a Chinese American ABC, grew up in the US, probably really affluent, like from an affluent family. They chose to come back. It's not that we didn't, like for us, like it's not like we have that many prospects of where else we can go, but they chose to come back on their own dime. They could leave at any time. And I think it was like those types of sentiments filled with ignorance that drove a lot of the things that we had to experience. But because of that, then I felt even more, it was even more important as a personal mission that I needed to foster greater understanding between US and China. Not only for the sake of other Asian Americans that was going to probably pursue something similar to me, but there just needed to be better understanding education about these different identities. And for me personally, it was like I suffered so much for 3 years. I was so traumatized for 3 years that I needed these 3 years to have meant something. It like I had to go through it because it was to help me succeed in something else later in life. So this is my way, I think, of trying to make sense of and give value to what had happened to me. And then that later inspired me to pursue a career in a degree in international affairs and to become an entrepreneur to continue working in the space with US, China, and the relations.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing the story. What an incredibly unique opportunity for you and your siblings to have grown up in China for 3 years and kind of just like explore the whole place with your mom. But yeah, we can definitely hear and feel like the growth and maturity that
Yeah.
happened over those 3 years, like all of those interactions that you had to face, those experiences that are so foreign to you, your siblings, as well as your mom. So crazy to hear, but also it's awesome to hear that like that actually created such a big impact on you to then go down this whole path of joining these two nations together.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah, I feel so bad to hear like what happened to you when you were 13. Like, but like why am I not surprised, right? Like, especially because you moved to Guangzhou, right? Like the southern area of China.
Yeah.
I think until now, they still feel like the girls are like you are not capable of doing anything. Like the greatest achievement of your life is to marry someone and to be a
Yeah.
wife, right?
Yeah.
It's like brings my memory to like the season. Also like we were talking about like the different communication style because I grew up in the northern area of China and I always been here, right? So like I feel is more like in the northern area is more like ballroom now. Like I don't know if if you move to here, like in the northern area, you're gonna have a different experience. But like the place you chose to stay and you grow up in the 3 years over there, it really brings you like what personal you like it's really help you to learn Chinese and Cantonese and like build who you are right now. So
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
yeah,
I think you
your
make a
experience
really
really
good,
inspires
yeah.
me, right?
Oh, thank
Yeah.
you so much, Victoria. But I think you make a really good point. And again, this goes back to kind of the diversity of China. Yes, like I think if I spent those 3 years in a different province, it would have been very different. And honestly, like in a lot of travels that we did in those 3 years outside of Guangdong, everywhere we went, the experience was different. So the it was definitely like cultural and unique to that time at like 2005 in Foshan in that region. So like I think that Foshan is probably a very different place now than it was, at that time. But it's also like it is blended into this like Cantonese culture. A lot of it are similar to like a Hong Kong Cantonese kind of culture where I think like this is my hypothesis, like Hong Kong it used to be this like British colony. So it took a lot of the British dry humor, sarcasm, judgmental kind of like worldview and got infused into the Cantonese kind of language and culture. So the way that people talk to each other too, it can be really judgmental and mean. But that's just the way that we talk to each other. It's not that we actually necessarily mean to be really mean. Sometimes we do, but otherwise, you're just like constantly sarcastic. You have to be constantly judgmental of something for you to ever get a point across. And I think that was another part of that shock I wasn't used to there. That was kind of infused to that area. But also like I don't think realistically my parents could have picked a different place for us. Because again, like at home we spoke Cantonese. my mom is such a brilliant woman that even though she's Taiwanese, she was able to learn and become fluent in Cantonese. But my dad's basically helpless. Like, running joke is Cantonese people can never learn Mandarin, even if they try. Like, they can never do it. There's too many tones in Cantonese. They don't know how to eliminate which tones to speak Mandarin. So for my parents, it's like, if we're going to mainland China, we got to find somewhere in Guangdong. So at least you're not thrown into just the Mandarin environment. You're thrown into somewhere that has both, so that it's a little bit more of a transition. But overall, I'm still very grateful that my parents did what they did. We did have a lot of fun too, traveling all over China with all these different places. And I don't think many 13-year-olds or people under 13 could have had that experience with their parents at that time. So we're like still very, very appreciative of that.
Thanks for joining us for our first episode of season 2. We had a great conversation with Leslie, so we've split this episode into 2 parts. Tune in next Wednesday for more insight on Leslie's journey as a female social entrepreneur. We'll see you then. Bye.